Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we are beginning Unit 9. Whew! Can you believe it? We've made it this far. Wow, Unit 9. I didn't think we'd get here, but we did. What is Unit 9, Mr. Ovalle? The Cold War. That's what we're talking about, the Cold War. Ooh, brr. If you remember from our last lecture, 14.4/14.5, we learned the beginnings of the Cold War and how the division between the capitalist democratic West, Europe, Western countries, slash NATO versus Eastern Europe and the communist Warsaw Pact, and not the literal divide of Eastern and Western Europe, but it's a divide nonetheless. So let's get into it. I'll shut up, trying to make a nice intro. And yeah, here we go. The Cold War, a fairly this chapter 15, we're doing all 5 sections, and this information will help some of you in your Cold War research project. So if you have any of the big major topics, you should be heavily paying attention to these videos as I try and describe them, if you want to read them on your own, you're more than welcome. All right, so the Cold War, this is a 2-title note age. Like I said, we're starting a new chapter, chapter 15, right after chapter 14. All right, and so today's lecture is how the Cold War unfolded, past tense. It's ended. Shut up, Mr. Ovalle. All right. Chapter 15, Section 1. Let's go. That was your warm-up. Objectives. We're going to discuss the ensuing economic and political shifts of the Cold War. We're going to trace the spread of the development of nuclear weapons and alliances and describe how life was like during the Cold War for both the Soviet Union and the US of A. All right, so alliances, much to the demise or surmise of the Treaty of Versailles and the 14 points, no secret alliances. Well, alliances kind of caused the Cold War, actually. So Cold War confrontation began in Europe, where the 2 superpowers' armies confronted each other after World War II. Each superpower formed their own European military alliance made up of the nations that had occupied/protected, superpowers being the US and the Soviet Union. The US led the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in Western Europe, and the Soviet Union led the the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. And the 2 alliances in Europe will face off against each other along the so-called Iron Curtain, which is a figurative line between the democratic West and the communist East. So this is NATO, and this is the Warsaw Pact. All right, and these gray in Europe are not holes in Europe; they're just neutral. They don't want the smoke. All right, Berlin. So Berlin was a key focus of the Cold War tensions, as we described in the last lecture. The city was split literally between the between the democratic West Berlin and the communist East Berlin. And remember, Berlin is in East Germany, occupied by Soviet Union. So in the 1950s, West Berlin became a showcase for Western German prosperity. There was a massive exodus of low-paid Eastern Germans who were unhappy with communism will flee to the city of the West. And to stop this flight, East Germany built a wall in 1961 that sealed off West Berlin, and this is known as the Berlin Wall. When completed, the Berlin Wall was a massive concrete barrier topped with barbed wire and patrolled by guards. The walls showed that workers far from enjoyment of the communist paradise that Stalin and Lenin and Marx had created had been forced to stay from leaving. So literally, remember, they also closed off all railroads going into Western Germany. Not fun, not fun. All right. So the Berlin Wall, physically, right there. And here's some construction of the Berlin Wall. This is supposed to be a GIF. Can it play? I don't know. But this is like one of the remote areas where the wall was being built, and you have people who are fleeing for their lives because they don't want to be. Almost think of this as a coyote leading Mexicans across the American border, right? In secret, these people are trying to traverse through the barbed wire fences, and when you're watching this GIF, I know it's not a GIF, but it's not playing. But these people go through this barbed wire so fast that like they get cut, but they're full of adrenaline and their blood is pumping, and so they get through. And that's kind of what it is. I mean, you could probably look it up on Google. All right, instances of resistances, bars, dab. In East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were where other revolts against the Soviet Union's domination. In 1953, East Berlin workers, around 50,000, confronted the Soviet army in the streets of the capital. The uprising will spread to other East German cities. However, there were no match for Soviet tanks. In 1956, Eastern Europeans challenged the Soviet Union through economic reform in Poland and Hungary. The Poles responded to Soviet-backed arrests of non-communist leaders and government seizures of private lands and industries. Stop me if that never sounds like anything communist. But, you know, government seizure of property, controlling the means of production. Anyways, Hungarian leader Imre Nagy went furthest by ending the one-party communist rule and tried to pull them out of the WP Warsaw Pact. However, the Soviet Union launched a massive assault that overwhelmed the resistance, and Nagy would be executed. Sorry, bruh. That's Nagy, R.I.P. Soviet tanks in Hungary. More Soviet tanks. This is like the glorification of the military, right? Kind of what you see in what was it, in like last summer when like Kim Jong-un would be showcasing his military. And all right, so you have something called the Prague Spring in early 1968. We're fast forwarding now. Woo! We're all the way in 1968, people. Czechoslovak leader Alexander Dubček introduced more freedom of expression and limited democracy. And this blossoming of greater freedom is known as the Prague Spring. Because, you know, flowers in spring blossom, they grow. It shows real growth, limiting democracy and allowing some freedom of expression. However, Soviet leaders feared that democracy would threaten communist power and the Soviet domination in that area. So Warsaw Pact troops launched a massive invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968, and they quickly suppressed the Czechs and their freedoms. Bye-bye. That's Dubček. I always have, it's always funny to watch this guy flee a soldier with a gun. And yeah, I don't know why he just didn't shoot him. And here's some resistance. We're going to stick this pipe in between the tank and make it break. I don't know. Or we'll take a stick to it. Maybe that's a wooden stick or a pipe. Who knows? Here you have some soldiers. I'm guessing they're protecting protesters. And Pravda, that's what Prague means in Czech. Prague. Anyways, the F word, fear. One of the most terrifying aspects about the Cold War was the arms race that soon developed following the end of World War II. At first, the U.S. was the only country with nuclear weapons. However, in 1949, the Soviet Union developed and launched their first nuclear weapon and tested it successfully. By 1953, both countries had tested their first hydrogen bomb, which are more destructive than atom bombs, which were used on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Critics argued that nuclear war would destroy both sides, yet each superpower wanted to deter the other from launching their own weapons. So both sides engaged in a race to match each other's weapons called, never mind, I got ahead of myself. This resulted in a balance of terror. You have mutually assured destruction or MAD, in which each side knew if the other side knew that the other side itself be destroyed if it launched its own weapons. So they're like, if you launch your weapons, we're launching ours, and so be it if we destroy each other. It is what it is. Mutually assured destruction. You're mad. You're crazy. And people will live in fear during the 50s and 60s. So here's the USSR A-bomb. Google it. You'll find the same picture. This is the US's hydrogen bomb tested. I want to say it was tested in some remote island out in the Pacific that the US controlled. And that's a bigger mushroom cloud than this atomic bomb. It almost looks like a painting. And I tried my best to find a Soviet H-bomb. I think this is the picture, but you know, as you can tell, the mushroom clouds are much larger, right? All right, so you have SALT. Again, this lecture is kind of going all kind of not really all over the place, but in a sense all over the place in accordance to years, right? So to reduce the threat of nuclear war, the two sides met at disarmament talks called the SALT talks, SALT agreements. Although they mutually distrustingly slowed the progress, the rivals did, however, reach to some agreements. By 1969, this is when the arms race is kind of at its highest peak. The Soviet Union and the U.S. began the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, to limit the number of nuclear weapons held by each side. In 1972 and 1979, they both signed agreements to set the limits again. And one of the SALT agreements was to limit the anti-ballistic missiles, ABMs, which could shoot down other missiles from hostile countries. So they now have the technology in either 72 or 79, where now missiles have the technology to shoot down other missiles if they're launched. ABMs were seen as a particular threat to the balance of terror because by giving the other side protection against the other, it might encourage the protected side to attack. Like, well, hey, we have ABMs, so we can shoot down their missiles if they're fired, and we can still shoot ours because they don't have them. You know, it's kind of that. Well, we have the technology, they don't. We're protected. Let's launch it. That's the kind of thinking. And they could also provoke a renewed arms race by building these up. So they said, we don't want these built. In the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan launched the program to build, quote, a Star Wars missile defense against a nuclear attack. And if you remember, Star Wars, the original, episode 4, was it out in 1974, 70 something? Because I think episode 5 was 1977. So yeah, Star Wars is big around that time. And hey, Ronald Reagan playing off the movie and its fame, we're gonna build a Star Wars missile defense. Critics thought it violated the ABM treaty, so they signed another strategic arms reduction treaty START in 1991. But it's so much later because in the 80s he wanted to build this missile defense system, but 91 they're like, okay, let's get rid of it. All right, so you have the era of détente. So American and Soviet arms control agreements led to an era of détente, aka the relaxation of tensions during the 70s, because the 50s and 60s were so on edge. The American strategy under détente was to restrain the USSR through diplomatic agreements rather than by military means. The détente era ended when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Was it 1979? Yes. By the late 60s, Britain, France, and China had developed their own nuclear weapons. However, many world leaders worked to keep the arms race from spreading any further. In 1968, many countries signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. These nations agreed not to develop nuclear weapons or stop the spread of developing of nuclear weapons. Whew. Globalized Cold War. So although the Cold War began in Central Europe, it quickly spread around the world. When World War II ended, the Soviets were assisting communist forces in China and Korea. We'll see that later. American leaders saw that the U.S. faced the conflict as global as the two world wars that had preceded it, and they therefore developed policies to respond to challenges anywhere in the world. So, again, to reiterate, as a part of this strategy contained Soviet power, you know, the idea of containment. The U.S. reached out to the rest of the world, both diplomatically and militarily. The NATO alliance with Europe's democracies was only one of several regional alliances the U.S. was a part of or other European democracies were a part of. In 1955, the U.S. and its allies formed the new alliance of Southeast Asia. They called it the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, which included US, Britain, France, Australia, Pakistan, Thailand, New Zealand, and the Philippines. You have the Central Treaty Organization, which included Britain, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, CENTO. And the U.S. will form military alliances with individual nations just like Japan and South Korea. And like I said, the USSR formed their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact in Europe, and also with other governments in Africa and Asia. They also had an alliance with Communist China from 1949 to 1960. More on that later. And the Soviets were also surrounded by the U.S. Navy with army bases surrounding the Soviet bloc. So this is NATO, blue, versus red, Warsaw Pact. Okay, this is SEATO, right? Not really Southeast Asia. The only Southeast Asian countries, I mean, if you consider the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and the only other country is Thailand. Because, I mean, this is a stretch to call Pakistan Southeast Asian. Because isn't India considered South Asia? I don't know, man. Anyway, CENTO. It was just Britain, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. And if you care to know, Britain had interests in these three countries, just saying, 4 countries, whatever. Oh my gosh. Stop it. All right. Communism spreads. So both superpowers had a global reach. Local conflicts in many places played into the Cold War. Often the U.S. and its allies supported one side, the Soviet Union supported the other. Through these struggles, the superpowers would confront each other indirectly. Cold War. And political shifts added to these Cold War tensions. So when communist forces took over mainland China in 1949, I'm going to say it later in the chapter lectures, but China was in a civil war before Japan invaded. And when Japan invaded, both sides said, hey, let's combine together and fight off and resist the Japanese. And then right after World War II ended and the Japanese were kicked out of China, they resumed their civil war. So communists, surprise, surprise, will take over China, 1949. The U.S. feared for a tide of communism would sweep around the world, and this is called the domino theory, although I think I'll talk about it later. So during this time, European colonies in Africa and Asia demanded independence. As colonies battled for independence, liberation leaders and guerrillas frequently sought out help from either superpower, and sometimes conflicts turned into shooting wars, especially in Asia, in Korea and Vietnam. It's also getting hot in here. Cuba. One of the most serious conflicts in the Western Hemisphere involved the Latin American island nation of Cuba, which is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. In the 1950s, the communist leader, Fidel Castro, organized an armed rebellion against their corrupt dictator, Fulgencio Batista. In 1959, Castro and his guerrilla army were victorious and sought to change the entire country. And this is called the Cuban Revolution. And Castro won support from the Soviet Union because, if you remember from the Spanish-American War, I don't think you guys do. Well, the Spanish-American War was fought, and the U.S. fought against Spain, and in Cuba, the Philippines, and some other Pacific islands that the Spanish held. And even in I want to say Mexico, but I could probably very well. Yeah, I'm wrong there. It's not Mexico. Anyways, they're fighting against the Spanish. They take control of the Soviet Union. Oh, Puerto Rico as well, and take over Cuba. And so the U.S. had always had diplomats, agencies, industries, companies in Cuba. And Castro wanted to kick the Americans out. So obviously he's anti-American. He's going to ask for support with the Soviet Union. He will nationalize businesses and put most of the land under government control. So even though America had, sugar plantations in Cuba, by nationalizing the businesses means the Cuban government gains control over that land, and they kick out the Americans. However, Castro will severely restrict his civilians' political freedoms, and critics were often jailed or silenced, and this is going to lead to thousands upon thousands fleeing to Florida. That's Fidel Castro. That's Castro and his brother, I believe, is right here. And this is Che Guevara. All right, oink, oink, Bay of Pigs. So the U.S. attempted to bring down this communist regime so close to home. President John F. Kennedy supported an invasion attempt by U.S.-trained Cuban exiles. This Bay of Pigs invasion was known for where the invaders came ashore. It quickly ended in failure because Castro's forces captured the invaders. And it was said that, it was only Cubans who were re-invading and trying to spark a revolution. However, when they called for backup, it's pretty obvious that it would have showed the Americans were involved in this, and it could have caused so much more tension between the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the United States, even though it does. And so they called for backup, and the planes never came because JFK didn't want us to be found out. Although it was kind of obvious who did the helping, but it is what it is. So in response to that, the U.S. imposed a trade embargo that remained until 5 years ago, in 2016. So this is Cuba. Bay of Pigs is right there. There's a political cartoon of JFK with a Cuban cigar blown up in his face because the Bay of Pigs was a failure for JFK. So now you have something known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 1962, the Soviet Union will send nuclear weapons and materials to be built by Cuba. JFK responded by imposing a naval blockade that prevented any further shipments. Kennedy demanded that the Soviets remove their missiles from Cuba, and what followed are a tense 10 days, known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, for fear of a nuclear war to begin. And there was already fear of that, right, throughout the world. But they came to an agreement with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who agreed to remove the Soviet missiles, and war was avoided. What also is not said is how they came to the agreement, because the U.S. had nuclear weapons in Turkey, which is very close to the Soviet Union, and they wanted those removed from Turkey, and they would remove the Cuban missiles from Cuba, point at America. So here are some pictures of some spy planes looking and finding, oh, what is going down in Cuba? And here you have Khrushchev. This is obviously pro-American propaganda, political cartoon. JFK arm wrestling Nikita Khrushchev, who's sitting on an H-bomb towards the U.S. And he's sitting on an H-bomb for the Soviet Union. That's Nikita Khrushchev. Soviet communism. So, this lecture is getting long, people. So victory in World War II brought a few rewards for Soviet people. Now we're talking about Stalin. We were talking about Khrushchev. Now we're talking about Stalin. Like I said, it's kind of all over the place. Anyways, Stalin continued his ruthless policies. He filled labor camps with, quote, enemies of the state, and seemed ready to launch new purges upon his death in 1953. And as we know, in the Soviet Union, the government controlled all aspects of life. The communists valued obedience, discipline, and economic security. They wanted to spread their ideology worldwide and their economic policies too. And remember, in command economies, governments often make the most economic decisions, but do it from a political sense that doesn't really benefit the economy, since the government owns all the property. So you have this idea of peaceful coexistence. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev, who we just saw, emerged as a new Soviet leader. In 1956, he shocked top Communist Party leaders as he denounced Stalin's abuse of power. You don't criticize dirty Stalin, even though he's dead. Anywho, he still maintained the Communist Party's control, but he closed the prison camps and eased censorship. He called for, quote, peaceful coexistence with the West. Khrushchev's successor, Leonid Brezhnev, will hold power until from the mid-60s until 1982. And under Brezhnev, critics will kind of repression and reform, kind of like how the czars were, because Khrushchev, who kind of rules, like eases up a little bit from Stalinist policies, Brezhnev turns back to repression, and critics will face arrest and imprisonment. You have some Soviet bravery. Despite the risk of punishment, some courageous people dared to criticize the government. You have a guy named Andrei Sakharov spoke out for the civil liberties. Brezhnev's government silenced him. R.I.P. As a soldier during World War II, you have a guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he's going to write a letter to a friend about Stalin. And because of that, Solzhenitsyn was sent to a prison camp, although he fought for Stalin in World War II. Under Khrushchev, he would be released, and he wrote fiction that drew upon his experiences as a prisoner. His writing would be banned in the Soviet Union, and he was exiled in 1974. And their writings, his writings, would inspire others to resist communist policies. Almost there. The Cold War wasn't just about a military rivalry. It was about a competition between the two very contrasting economic and political values. It gave citizens freedoms to make economic gains and political decisions and focus on freedom and prosperity. That's capitalism. While communist countries have command economies, capitalist countries have market economies. If you don't know that by now, I have failed you. In market economies, producers and consumers make up the economic decisions. Prices are based on supply and demand in a free market where property is privately owned. The government doesn't own it. Producers came to compete to offer the best products for the lowest prices. Walmart, that sounds like an ad. Producers who won the consumers' businesses will make the profits and grow. And the U.S. is based on a market economy, but the U.S. and other Western countries have what is called mixed economies, because sometimes the government plays in the economic role. And here you have a clash between the Soviet Union and America. All right, so containment and fallout. America's basic policy of communism was containment. This was about containing communism within existing boundaries and preventing further expansion. This strategy meant supporting any government facing invasion or internal rebellion by communists. This nuclear threat led many people to build in the U.S. fallout shelters. So if you've ever played the game Fallout, there you go. Fallout shelters were structures designed to protect people from fallout, which are radioactive particles from a nuclear explosion, just ask Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1961, the U.S. government launched a community fallout shelter program to create public and commercial fallout shelters with 2 weeks worth of supplies. And the fear of a nuclear attack launched at its height during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And because of that, thousands of Americans built shelters in their backyards, and schools will practice drills because hiding under your desk is going to protect you from nuclear particles. Oh, there's so many more. Oh, this is the last slide. Whew. Bless me. So you have the Red Scare. So the Cold War led to a Red Scare within the United States during the 1940s and 50s. Many Americans feared communists who were inside the U.S. government might try to undermine the U.S. government. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy will lead a hunt for these suspected U.S. communists. McCarthy became known for his unproven charges. He will accuse innocent people of being communists, and the fear that it created became known as McCarthyism. It soon faded when he questioned the patriotism of the U.S. military. And mind you, this is during the 50s where everything was broadcasted. So the whole public of the United States found out that Joseph McCarthy was accusing military officers of being communists. And you just you also have something called the HUAC, which is the House Un-American Committee, and the Hollywood 10, which were 10 Hollywood producers, editors, writers who were found out to be communists and were blacklisted. And when you become blacklisted, you can not be up for any future movies, jobs, anything in Hollywood. So the Hollywood 10, that's the long and short of it. And hey, whew, we finished. That was a long lecture. I'm sorry about that, but you know, we just went through 48 slides. Man, hopefully you did enjoy that and learn a little bit more about some of the Cold War beginnings. Your homework is to do page 510 questions 3 through 5. So if you did like that, make sure you smash that like button. Help your fellow history teacher out in trying to gain some ad revenue. Yeah, right. Anyways, and as always, stay safe, wash your hands. Peace.